out.
is regards, Ethan, it was really interesting that you spoke about, the history of this narration and how it was used as a temporary decor. And you go through all those art movements in art history and all these things. So it seems like the comic or the graphic novel has a similar type of history that leads up to, I don't know, postmodernism or whatever, and that kind of thing. It seems kind of very similar.
Yes.
Is that true, or how do you feel?
Well, it is true. I mean, there have been the early comics, as you saw from some of the examples I was showing, were really more like stage presentations, for example. So they were the reason why everything was always at the same distance. You always saw full figures and always moving sort of left to right. And much the way you'd go and sit in a theater and watch people up on a stage, or even early film, which was derived from stage. And then as artists figured out that you can actually sort of look at things from different angles, that changed the way they could show things. And again, as I said, there were different periods where the content was made by age. And so there was a period in the 1950s where comic book artists, they were trying to show things that were a little too lurid. And actually there was almost a kind of a government crackdown on what they were doing. That there were some people who thought that some of the horror comics and some of the crime comics could lead to juvenile delinquency.
I remember that.
You remember that?
That was when I was reading comics.
Yes, right. And then rather than be subjected to any kind of censorship, the comics companies themselves said, we'll create our own standards and stick to them. It was actually kind of a veiled move by certain companies who were already doing what you could call wholesome comics to force the others out of business, so there wouldn't be competition. But it stifled a lot of creativity in comics for many years, and that's why the underground stuff, like the Robert Crumb comics, were this amazing explosion, because they started putting in all kinds of stuff in comics that you couldn't do anywhere, and that gave it a whole different kind of life.
I used to read a lot of manga, I remember, but I was like 16, 17, sauciness, but
right.
So was it always a little bit more acceptable in the East, or to have very graphic, but sexually explicit things, for example?
There's a different standard in a country like Japan than there is here, as far as what they show. A whole different standard about nudity in general, for example. So that, and bodily functions. And so yeah, a lot of that stuff has gotten into even kids' comics in ways that we would never do in America. And the fact that you read manga is also very interesting, because
I'm Austrian though, so I grew up in Austria.
And what years are you talking about? Because in America, manga didn't really start coming in until the 80s, and that was just like
so I read it probably early 90s.
Right, and in the 90s is in America when a lot of the what we call girls manga started coming in. Manga that's mostly created by women and designed specifically for a female audience. A lot of that started coming into America, and that's where a lot of my students now, who are young women, grew up reading that rather than American comics. So you have that influence coming in as well.
Akira, I remember that.
Yeah.
That movie who
Right.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes.
What kind of materials did you use when you create your graphic novels?
Ink and paper. And I use traditional drawing pens, the kind that you put a nib in a holder and dip it into ink, and brushes. I remember when I was a teenager, first discovering that artists actually used brushes in order to ink comics. I was like flabbergasted. We made brushes, right? Because someone had given me some pens, and I was trying to get all these different variations of line, but I could never get a line that was quite as smooth looking or as graceful looking with a pen, because the way it scratched across the paper. And then a friend of mine told me, well, you do that with a brush. And I was like, brush? How do you do that? Well, you dip it in the ink, and I spent like a whole summer trying to the little number 2 watercolor brush and figuring out how to use that thing to get the lines that I was seeing in the comics. So I do everything still in, I use pencil, usually like an HB pencil, to rough out the pages, and then ink things in black, but I haven't published anything in black ink in a while. So like Asterios, that book that I did that was published recently, everything was drawn in black ink, but there's no black in the final book, because then I scanned it into Photoshop and separated things into the colors that were going to be the printing inks. So then what I submitted were these files that were all solid black images, but I'm telling the printer, print this one in this color ink and print this one in this color ink, knowing how they were going to overlap. And meet. Did you have a question?
I was gonna ask you how you got the colors actually.
And I answered. Or did I? Was that?
You pretty much answered it because I was just wondering like what parts you did do like on Photoshop.
Yeah.
And if someone did if you picked out the colors or if someone else.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
And it's all done in what are called Pantone Colors.
Mhm.
You understand what that is? Most printing is done CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And that's how tints of that give you a pretty wide range of color if you use a screen of dots. But you can also print these Pantone colors, which is the color of the ink is actually mixed for the one you want. And you can print that as a solid, orange or brown or colors that you have to blend in CMYK. So my book was done with Pantone colors. But yes, I had to, after I drew I had a rough idea when I was penciling the page what kind of color it would be. And then, as I said, once the ink stage was done, and I had it in the computer, then I set up the file on Photoshop that you can build Pantone files. So then I would make the two colors and see how it was going to look beforehand. It's pretty accurate. I mean, it never looks exactly like it does on a computer. But that's what you look at. You have to look at a printed sheet of the actual color to really see what it's going to look like.
So one thing that was really interesting that you mentioned in the talk was about how you can be so good at drawing from life, but it's another thing to fabricate, figures from your own mind. And I was wondering, as your process, like how do you grow, like what references do you use, and how do you go about that?
I made a decision early on when I wanted to be a professional comic book artist, meaning I hated comic book, that I didn't want to rely on photo reference, because it seemed to me like it would take a lot of time to always be looking for the image that you need, or even shooting a lot of photos that you need. And it would be much quicker if you had an understanding of the figure good enough that you could make up the drawings as you go. Now, so that was a goal. And how did I get to that point? Draw, draw, draw. Look, look, look. It's really that. It was like, and look for the way you approach drawing, too. For example, when I don't draw a lot from life these days. I look a lot. When I ride the subway, I look at the way people stand and sit. I look at their hair. I look at their clothing. I try to look at details of a room and see the odd little things that you wouldn't expect. The way the corner of a wall might go at an odd angle. You tend to just draw a rectangle, but in real life, something might not feel that way. But when I was drawing from life, knowing that I wanted to do something like comics, I always drew looking for structure. So if I were drawing a figure or an object, a car, a building, I would draw thinking about what's the structure underneath this thing, and why is it that when the figure, say, sits this way or stands that way, what happens to the whole body, what happens to the rest of the body? It's, I know something about anatomy that's fairly rudimentary. I never made a real study of anatomy the way some people do, into all the muscles and the way they all insert and the way they wrap around the bones and all that. I know a little bit about it. But to me, making convincing drawings that are inventive has more to do with gesture and proportion. And if you can get those things, if you've got a muscle or a bone a little bit off, it's not going to be as noticeable if you really capture the liveliness of the way a person moves or stands or sits. Especially, there's a lot of, in doing superhero comics, which is what I wanted to do, what I trained myself to do and then got away from. There's a lot of emphasis on the figure in action. But what really brings a character to life sometimes is what that figure looks like in repose as well. So it's not always about these big dynamic poses of jumping through the sky or running fast, but what happens when the character is standing at rest or sitting or doing other things that bring the humanity into the drawing? So that's what I would say. It's really just what it is you're looking for as you're making a drawing. Yes?
Are there any discoveries you've made as a comic artist or any tools that you use that you feel like you would be able to use if you decided to do traditional printing again? That would be useful formally?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would go back to painting. One of the reasons why I stopped painting was I realized that my interest was not so much in making a single image. My interest is really in progressions of images that tell a story. I had a little bit of an opportunity to do what you're saying. For a short period in the 90s, I actually did some illustration work that I wasn't planning to do, but there was an opportunity to come along. And I took it as a chance to do things I didn't do in my comics, which is I used paint to make illustrations. I used water-based paint. And it was interesting to see what all those years of drawing comics brought, because it was a more graphic approach that I took to making the paintings. Much more sort of flat areas of color working against each other, rather than trying to say to model things in the round. And some use of line, other places where the color made an edge. But certainly using a brush to use ink for many, many years made my handling of a brush in the painting much better than it had been years before. Is there anything else about it?
Yeah, no, I suppose I was speaking more hypothetically because when you were talking about composing a page or panel, it's like, well, that's not much different from when we're thinking about making a painting and how it's going to tell a story and where your eye is going to follow it
Right.
and whatnot.
It's all the same stuff.
Yeah,
It really is.
yeah.
Yes?
I spent a while looking a lot at Lionel Fenninger.
Mm.
I used to look at his comics a lot as a kid,
Yeah.
and I never realized that he had also done this amazing body of like Cubist impressionist work.
Right.
And I was really intrigued when you were talking about time and kind of like the formal elements that could be manipulated in subtle ways to perform different kind of tasks in comic making. And I was just wondering how, if you've looked a lot at Lionel Fenninger, like how you see his comic making from a comic artist to a fine artist, like how does that carry over into his fine art?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I know the work, I don't know it intimately enough to tell you, oh, obviously there's a connection here. But I mean, I do think it's interesting that he started as a painter and then used those skills as a designer of things to bring into comics. And there's several painters who've done things sort of like that. I think it's Ad Reinhardt who did, his paintings are very severe, very close, subtle, flat areas of color. But then he did this series of comics about the art world that look kind of like underground comics. So maybe it's just an interest that painters have in comics. Why not? Someone else? Yes.
I was recently hired as an illustrator for a woman who she wrote a screenplay, but she's changing it into a graphic novel because they're very popular now.
Right.
So my issue is like when I draw myself, like for my own hobby, I know exactly what the characters look like, but
Right.
I'm trying to get into her head and figure out what the characters are in her mind.
Right.
So do you have any advice for me as to developing them? Because that's the stage I'm at right now. I haven't finalized what they look like.
Right. I can only imagine that you would probably want to come up with a number of sketches that are different possibilities, rather than presenting one thing where you say, this is what I've come up with, and she may say, it's not what I had in mind. If you have some variations,
That she could kind of.
that she could say, oh, I like the way this one's looking better than these three. But they could be within, you might have an idea based on what she's written that they have to be of a certain type, but you can bend them this way or that way to try, taller, thinner, wider, rounder, whatever, with using the same elements and then see what she responds to. That's probably the best way to go about it. Okay? Yes?
How was the transition from working for Marvel and into your own work economically, and how was that?
How was it? It was great at the time because I really got to a point doing that kind of work where I realized I got into making comics because of this work, but now that I'm doing it, it didn't turn out to be what I thought it would for me. So I knew I wanted to stop making those kinds of stories. Economically, fortunately, before I came to that decision, I worked on 2 very popular books with a writer named Frank Miller. And they sold well enough that I didn't have to worry about where my next month's paycheck was going to come from. I actually was getting some royalty money from those books, and so it actually afforded me the time to say, let me back up and think about this and decide what I want to do next. When I realized I didn't want to do those kinds of stories again, it was interesting, because when I sat down to try to draw, sketch out, like, what do I want to do? Every time I drew, what was coming out were things that were full of all the habits that I had developed from 3 years of drawing mostly superhero comics. And so I actually didn't like my drawing at all, and I had to stop for a little while, not draw at all, and just look at things and absorb things and do other kinds of things. I actually played music for a little while. It's another interest that I had had for years. And when I finally came back to drawing, it was almost like starting reinventing it again. Getting back to what is it I liked about drawing in the first place? Going way back, to amuse myself, to entertain myself, to make something that I found interesting. And that is what helped me get sort of away from these commercial habits and into the work that I'm doing now. But now that I've been distant enough from it, I can reach back and I can take some things that I learned from that as well and use them if I have to. Somebody has an answer. Yes.
And so I guess, I was wondering, when you ever did find your voice or your style in illustration, because I see that you tried on many different suits sort of while you were in your presentation, you did various different styles.
Right.
And I was wondering where you reached, what was the point that you basically said this is
There hasn't been.
There hasn't. So you
my,
still
my approach has, because I think of myself as a writer as well as an artist. I think I've always tried to approach each project with what should this one look like? What's the appropriate presentation for this particular thing that I want to do? And that's why you see that I try out these different styles, because this one might be the way to show this. This one might look better for this story. What I was finally able to do in Asterios Polyp, a 340-page book, was say, you know what, I'm going to make style part of the subject and theme of this book, so that I can take all these different approaches that I enjoy, but make them part of the content. And so that way I was able to do that within the context of the one work, so it doesn't have one consistent look throughout. There is a baseline kind of look throughout, but there are different styles that come in for different reasons. And so in that way I was able to use that interest that I have in working in many different ways for a single piece of work. Now the work I'm planning next probably isn't going to have that kind of wide range, but I'm still haven't quite settled on what it looks like exactly.
So it's a really postmodern.
I suppose it is. Right.
Incorporating style as an element.
Right. Yes.
Do you feel that, both for your work and for just in general, do you have a target audience? And do you feel that the audience who you may or may not be writing for, or who's reading your work and graphic novels in general, do you think that overlaps with people who are, enjoying fine art or consider themselves part of that world?
The only way I can answer that question, that makes sense, is to say, when I stopped doing the commercial comics and decided I want to make my own stuff, the only way I could approach it was, what do I want to see that I'm not seeing out there? So essentially, I was my target audience. I wanted to make comics that I wanted to read. And I think that's the only way I can say that I approach it is if I can make it interesting to me, then I assume that other people who like things that I like might also find it interesting. Because otherwise, if, you know, again, it's a more commercial idea to think the way the Japanese do, for example, in the commercial Japanese comics. We're making comics that are specifically geared to girls ages 10 to 16 who like volleyball. And they will be that specific about who they're targeting things at. To make the kind of work I make, it's much harder to sort of think about a certain demographic and say that's who I'm aiming at. As I said, it's much easier to think, well, what am I interested in? And just hope that, you know, my tastes are not so strange and obscure that only 3 or 4 people could possibly have the same interests. Yes, again.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
You said that narration is a big, the writing is a big part of the process.
Yes.
And you really wanted to tell a story versus just throwing some images out there. I was kind of curious, who are your favorite writers? Like, besides, I mean, I'm assuming Paul also like this writing.
Yeah, I like Paul.
So who would you say could influenced your way or your subject matter?
Every time someone asks me this, I wish I had brought a list.
Sorry.
Of that, right? Because, you know, I have names of people that I read in the past, and those are the names I always say, but then I think, well, wait, I've been reading other things since then. But
is it classics or is it everything?
It's both. It's. I mean, there are certain books that I've read that really stuck with me over the years. For example, books by Gabriel Garcia Marquez or by Milan Kundera. I recently read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I had never read Dickens before. I loved it, and I was surprised how humorous it was. How, you know, his biting humor that he has, boy, I read Annie Proulx a while back, and really thought that was great. I just read True Grit by Charles Portis,
I love that.
which is, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting book from the same kind of thing that I'm thinking about in my comics. It's very interesting who the narrator is.
Yeah.
You know, and it's this voice of this older woman talking about her younger self, and everything's filtered through her view of her descriptions of the characters and her descriptions of events. And you have to keep that in mind, that it's not an objective view.
Yeah. Do you see little drawings when you read books like that?
Not usually.
Like, oh, good. Cool, yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Yes.
Somebody else did.
Eric, you got a question?
No, it was just asked.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I noticed a lot in your comics that some of them almost seem to be commentaries on like the pure formal elements that assist like the comic in its read. Do you feel yourself enhancing the narrative more with these formal elements, or do you see yourself enhancing formal elements more with the narrative, or is it like just a balance of the two?
I'm going to say it's a balance because that's not necessarily, I don't find that a useful distinction often. You know, like the distinction between, say, form and content. To me, very often, form is content and content is form. And I'm always, as a storyteller, I'm just always looking for what is the most effective way to get this thing across. You know, I do think, you asked about a target audience. I don't think about a target audience, but I often do try to put myself on the other side of the page and think about, as a reader, you know, if I've drawn something out, will the reader understand what I'm trying to depict here? And there are different levels of that as well. Like I tell my students, there's a difference between, you know, mystery and confusion. You know, if you can create mystery by showing something and withholding some information so that the reader wants to keep reading, but you don't want it to be confusing where the reader doesn't even understand what the drawings are depicting or why the sequence of these 3 panels, that it doesn't make any sense. So there's always that balance to be held as well. But yeah, to me it's all about, is it working? And of course there's never just one way of doing something. So sometimes in the course of going through a draft, a first draft or a second draft, you know, I may have something told a certain way with a certain number of panels, and then I may think, well, what would that be like if I had, you know, twice as many panels to break that down and show different aspects, or if I took the words out completely, or if I added more words that are saying something different to complement this. I mean, there's all different ways to approach how it goes, but I don't think of it as now I'm working formally. And you know, now it's just content, you know, because it's very hard to separate those things, as far as I see. I mean, it's the kind of thing we talk about in school because we need to sort of break things down and say, look at the formal elements here. But when you're in the middle of making work, I don't think it's necessarily useful to be thinking, now I'm a formalist. I see it very differently. I see it as, for example, a composer doesn't write trumpet music for a piano, or piano music for a trumpet, because every instrument has its own unique properties and can't play the other. You write trumpet music for a trumpet, you write piano music for a piano. Rather than think, oh, I'm dealing with formal issues, I just think, well, I'm just writing piano music for a piano. Yes?
So apropos of this, the question about a favorite writer or something, I'm wondering, do you have any favorite painters?
My wife is one. I do, and again, you catch me.
I know the list, I always think I should have a list.
I know. You know, going way back, it would be, you know, Giotto and Leonardo, and then moving up through history up to something like the 20th century, it would be people like Beckmann and Augustin.
Yes.
And,
I love that.
You know, it's the drawing a blank thing.
More have imagery, maybe, it sounds like maybe they more have imagery than.
I would say so, although I mean, I love Rothko. I think Rothko's amazing.
You got fans over here.
Okay. What did I see about Miro? I mean, there's a lot of mid-century stuff that I like a lot. I think, you know, certainly Picasso, I mean, a giant, you know.
That's good.
Is that a good enough start? Yes.
Could you tell us something about the publishing process? Did you know when you were going to make this book you were going to have a publisher? Did you work with an editor? Did somebody say it has to be 300-something pages? What was that process like?
What was that process like? I had this idea for a book many years ago, and didn't get started on it in earnest until the early 2000s. And at that point, I did know that there was a publisher that I was hoping would be interested in the book. I actually submitted a different book. I submitted a proposal for a book, a collection of short stories I had previously published. But when the publisher I sent it to actually liked those stories, but wanted to meet with me and asked if I had a novel in the works, because from a marketing point of view, it's easier to sell a single story than a collection of short stories. And I said, actually, I do have something in mind, but I haven't started working on it yet. And eventually I did get started on it. I had no idea how long it would be. I knew it was going to be substantial. I didn't know it would go to 300. I thought maybe 200 pages. It ended up being much bigger than that. But fortunately, I was making enough money from other things I was doing that I didn't need to sign a contract to get an advance for this book, because I didn't want to, because I didn't know when it would be done. And I didn't want to feel the pressure of knowing that I've already been given some money for it, and they're expecting it, say, this year. What if I don't have it by then? There were many times when I thought, I'll have the book done by X, and it got pushed 2 or 3 times past that in my own mind. So I was able to, I had a very patient editor who just would always say, when you're ready, come to me. It wasn't until I had the book half done that I went to them and I said, now I have something to show you. Now tell me if you're interested, and then we'll talk. And it worked out that they were interested, and then I started talking about, okay, now I think I know when I'll have it done, because I had the whole rest of the book roughed out in some manner. But I felt much more comfortable knowing that the thing was almost completed before I was ready to sign on to a final date and take some money that I wouldn't have to give back. But they were, as I said, they were very patient and very accommodating of practically everything I asked for. I mean, they were really, and it's not just me, it's with the other cartoonists that they've been publishing graphic novels by. They really want the books to be what the author, if they've signed on for it, they want the book that the author is making. And so if you look at books that come out of the publishing house that published my book, Pantheon, you'll see various formats, you'll see various styles of working with different kinds of bindings, hardcover, softcover, whatever it is the artist has decided this is the way I want this book to be.
You planned all that out?
I designed every aspect of this book down to the colors. Do you have a copy?
I do.
Okay, down to the colors of the headband and tail of the book. One red, one blue, that are where the pages get stitched together. Once they told me that all these things are up for grabs, yeah, then, thank you. Then I was able to, this whole thing, see the red there, blue there.
The jacket is short of the book,
The
right?
jacket is short, exactly. That was on purpose because I wanted this sense. There's a few different things I was thinking about. One was I wanted this to reveal what was underneath. I wanted the jacket to only be half covered because I wanted you to see the structure underneath. I wanted there to be different tactile feeling when you picked up the book. You've got the rough cardboard, this fake cloth, and then the plastic coating on this so that the whole thing feels like I'm holding a real object of some kind. The paper, I wanted a paper that was this color. It's not white. It's a gray color. And I asked them if it could be recycled. And they found a paper that was recycled that they had to order specially from Japan in order to do this book. So they as I said, they really accommodated a lot of things I asked for as long as it was within their budget. And if I asked for something that was slightly outside the budget, we found a way to see if we could make it work. But their production, the guy they had in charge of production there is kind of a miracle worker when it comes to that.
Well, we should wrap up soon. David's been talking for a couple hours, but are there any last questions?
Last really good question.
What is the name of
It's a good question.
What the
the name Asterios Poly? Is that how you say it?
Asterios Poly?
Yeah,
Yes.
where that came from. Oh, it was interesting, by the way. But I just want to know what.
The part of his name is explained in the book.
Oh, really?
So if you read it, you'll get that.
Motivation.
I have a last question, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Daredevil or Batman? Which one? I gotta ask, and Saki, I know, but which is the favorite superhero that?
Everybody loves Batman.
Would you want to be Batman?
Would I want to be Batman? No,
Or
absolutely not. Who would I want to be?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't want to be either one.
No?
Oh, no.
No favorite superhero that you draw on that kind of appeal to you somehow, or like that'd be kind of cool.
Well, you gotta be pretty messed up to want that.
Alright, that's good.
Any chance now that they might be interested in the stories?
Yeah, that who?
Publisher? You said you had done some short stories, but they weren't that.
Oh, maybe, but I'll see if I want to publish them.
Oh.
Now that I spent all this time working on this big book, it's I feel more interested in going to the next book than looking backward. So,
Are
we'll
the
see.
stories just stories, or are they?
No, they're short comics that have been
Comics,
in
yeah.
various publications over the past 20 years.
Nice.
Well, thank you guys for asking such good questions.